Hello, I'm Andrew Culp. I'm the professor of media history and theory at California Institute of the Arts in the program of aesthetics and politics in the School of Critical Studies. Thank you so much for coming tonight. First, I want to thank the City of West Hollywood and Arts for helping host the WHAP series, which has been going on for a number of years now. I'd also like to thank CalArts, in addition to the School of Critical Studies, also the MA program in aesthetics and politics. I'd also like to draw your attention to a recent blog post by our student Irini, which goes through the digital epidermalization of the way in which data and crime data maps onto bodies, as well as the ways in which data is formatted and tabulated, and recent art projects that go through it. You can visit on our blog, Open Assembly, at calarts.edu. And I'd like to thank you, the audience, for joining us tonight. First, I'd like to introduce the WHAP series very briefly. It is a series that stands for West Hollywood Aesthetics and Politics that's been going on for almost a decade now. And we've been so excited to have guests from a variety of disciplines, from art and architecture to all kinds of social theory and social scientists like tonight. And this is part of a longer semester-long series. Its theme is called Blackout, and I'm convening it. It was prompted by media theorist Simone Brown's writing, in which she argues that those targeted by surveillance are not always those who need increased visibility. In fact, visibility might not be the goal. And she proposes instead to look for, quote, fugitive acts of escape, resistance, and productive disruptions that happen when Blackness enters the frame. So a brief note on our format. We're gonna have a presentation that begins with Professor Jefferson and then a response. But the whole time, please make sure to write in your comments, your ideas, even quotes or other things in the Q&A or in the chat box in YouTube. Note that there might be a short delay for our presenters to get back to your Q&A as well, but we're really looking forward to them addressing them in the half an hour to 45-minute Q&A period at the end of the talk. So without any further ado, I'd like to introduce our two speakers for tonight for the talk, Information Capitalism Meets Racial Capitalism, Surveillance and Racial Criminalization in the Digital Age. Our presenter is Brian Jefferson, who's an associate professor of geography and geographic information science at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. His work looks at digital technology, racial capitalism, and the state in urban contexts. And then his respondent will be Shakir Rahman, who's a community organizer and attorney with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition. So please, as a group, join me in welcoming Professor Jefferson for his talk.
Hi, thanks a lot, Andrew. And thanks for inviting me. As I was saying earlier to the graduate students, I was really looking forward to this talk, and especially getting to talk to people in media studies, but also the people from West City of Hollywood, and of course, Shakir. So looking forward to this. So I am going to share my screen. I'll have to send it, but I could start a little bit in talking about my work. And what it looks at is criminal justice and digital technology in the smart city. And it's really informed a lot, of course, by Simone Brown's work and her work on racializing surveillance. But what I want to look at is sort of the relationship between city government and also the IT sector. So in my book, and some of the students have read it, what I'm really trying to understand is how does the sort of emergence of the smart city change urban crime control? So earlier, like what got me interested in the research was, I was saying earlier that I was reading a lot in news about surveillance in China. And this was becoming a sort of really big topic in around 2010s. You were seeing a lot of it in Western news media. So it prompted me to think about, oh, well, in what ways do we have surveillance in the US? And is it comparable? Because there was already a lot of work in poli-sci about the war on terror, information sort of surveillance apparatus. So I wanted to look at how this sort of surveillance apparatus was also spreading throughout cities, in particular through criminal justice agencies. So just to talk about the history of this, I have to look back to the war on crime and sort of the ways that cities were dealing with high crime neighborhoods and the technological advancements that came during that period. So one of the things that was important in writing the book was to take this historical approach and sort of think about how technology, how racial criminalization, and how urban political economy have had a long relationship that goes back at least to the late 1800s, early 1900s. So the story sort of starts for me with, if we look in the late 1800s with industrial cities, Chicago, Philadelphia, New York City, and the ways that they were magnets, especially for immigrant labor during this time, and how they drew people from Southern and from Eastern Europe, and eventually drew Black people from the South during the Great Migration. And you had these sort of influxes of stigmatized people, because of course in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Eastern Europeans and Southern Europeans weren't necessarily seen as white, right? They were seen as from the lower countries. And then eventually you would have Black people who were coming up north, and Mexican people who would come, you know, earlier in the 19th century, but more so towards the mid 1900s. So in looking during this period, some of the deviants, the sort of public enemies of cities at the time, were studied by the Chicago social ecologists or urban ecologists. And with these sociologists, they looked at immigrants and who came to these cities and lived in low-income communities, and said that there was sort of a recipe for deviance in the inner zone 2, it was called. And this is where you would have mostly Polish, Italian, and then increasingly Black, and poor Jews from the Jewish diaspora. And you would have homelessness, and you would have crowdedness and disease. And this was seen as sort of the deviant part of the city. And most of these workers, again, they were coming to work in factories, but you also saw a lot of labor organizations, so the anarchist movements and labor radicalism. So these were sort of the public enemies of the industrial city in the US during the late 1800s and early 1900s. They were the paupers, the homeless, but they were also the anarchists, they were also the labor radicals. And the police apparatus was, in many ways, it modified itself to be able to contain these problematic populations. So if we look to like the early 1900s, you'll see some small technological innovations in urban policing. So one of them is the telegraph. So the urban police were actually the first urban departments to use telegraphs. And they used them to help dispatch patrol wagons. So especially during labor movements, when there were riots and there were protests and there was clashes between police and organizers, you would have people get on these boxes where you could get on the telegraph and send a message to the police station to dispatch a paddy wagon, they were called. Of course, you know, etymology is a slur towards Irish immigrants. But you also get in the 1920s, you get fingerprinting technology becomes a big thing. So under J. Edgar Hoover's FBI, America actually builds the biggest fingerprint database in the world by the 1920s. So for me, in thinking of technology and policing and criminal justice in cities, and the technologies that we see start to emerge during this earlier period are technologies for identification, so fingerprints, but there are also technologies to coordinate with patrol wagons, so for dispatch, right? And what I argue is that these two core, one of the things I'm saying is like these two core functions are something that stays relatively static over the decades when talking about, thinking about criminal justice technology. So that would be sort of the first period that I'm looking at, the industrial period in American cities. And then next we go to the deindustrializing period, the post-war period after World War II. And what you have is a different demographic scenario at this time, where these cities are disproportionately Black and Latinx, or at least the industrial workforces. And you have, after the war in 50s, 60s, and 70s, factories that are leaving the urban, the cities throughout the US. And they're going to rural America, and they're also going to suburban America. So what that is it leaves behind a sort of huge mass of under and unemployed workers, but B, who are already racial minorities and already stigmatized and already had histories of being criminalized, whether through immigration politics or whether through anti-Black politics, of course, Jim Crow, etc. So now we have a different demographic group, different histories of stigmatization, and you have the response to a lot of the protest and revolt against the conditions and living in poverty and living in underfunded public housing units were the protests during the 60s and revolt during the 60s and the sort of spectacular sort of confrontations with police and military that you see in the mid through the late 60s. And the government's response to this period was first through militarization. So one of the things that you see is the use of the National Guard more, but also police officers getting higher caliber weaponry and firearms. So that is sort of one of the responses to the revolts. The next thing you see, of course, is mass incarceration, which will really start during the 80s. And it's using this very punitive and militarized sort of approach to not only the protesters, but also we know of the other urban problem populations. So this would be homeless people. This would be, of course, when the crack cocaine crisis arrives in the 80s. And it would be the unemployed and the underemployed. The mentally ill, we know, of course, is also overrepresented in the prison system. So during all of this time, you're getting what we call carceral governance start to build up in the 1980s. And then we get, of course, an explosion of the imprisoned population. So for me, I was also interested about the technological side. What were some of the technologies that were being developed? And actually what I found, and it wasn't something that I was really going into looking for, but I guess it's kind of common sense in retrospect, is that mass incarceration would not have been possible without communications and telecommunications technology and cutting edge technology at that. So what we start to see, even if we go back to the 60s under the Lyndon Johnson administration, is the Law Enforcement Administration, Assistance Administration, which starts to build a national plan for modernizing police departments in cities in specific. And you get to start to see a lot of technological development here. And a lot of that development happens with cooperation or in conjunction from what now we would call big tech. They maybe weren't big at the time as they are now, but they were just becoming big tech, especially in the 80s when you get to see more computer companies that are starting to expand as personal computing comes. But you get things like, and we talked about it earlier, the computer assisted dispatch, which is CAD, the CAD system, computer aided dispatch, which is a system in which when you make a 911 call, the call can be directed through a computer to either somebody who's in a police station, or it can be directed straightly to a patrol unit, the nearest available patrol unit, to help increase or slash, I should say, response times for patrol vehicles. So that's sort of one technology. You also, in the 80s, you get to see more digitized mapping being used. So geographic information science, which is in my field. And what you get are these targeting systems that will use police and arrest data and to find hotspots. And the idea is you can make a map that shows this is a hotspot, a higher crime place. And the idea is that you would dispatch more patrol units in those areas on a permanent basis to bring down the crime rate. But then I started to see other stuff like databases. So one of the things that happens during mass incarceration is that the paper filing systems start to get overloaded, and they have to transition to digital. Because so many people are being arrested, so many people are being arraigned, so many people are being processed and incarcerated. And then these people, there are profiles on them with their own personal information. And then in the prisons, right, you need medical information and all types of demographic information. And what I start to see during this period is that mass incarceration, just like all government branches during the time, were becoming more and more reliable on digital technology in order to, I think, execute a project as massive as mass incarceration, because you can throw numbers at you, but well over 2 million people are incarcerated. This is, if you adjust for the total population of the US, we've incarcerated more person per capita than the Soviets did, right? Than South Africa did during the resistance against apartheid. So what you're talking about is a massive, with the Gilmore book, like essentially gulag system. But a lot of it depends on bringing what are disproportionately urban knights and relocating them to what became increasingly rural located prisons. So if you watch Brett Story's documentary on prison landscapes, you'll see that there's this sort of there's this geographical dimension to mass incarceration where you're relocating people from cities to rural areas back and forth. So then I became interested, well, what sort of technological developments were required for this? And, and you dig and you start to see things like algorithms that are built for prison siting, for constructing new prisons, algorithms that would say, well, this area is a better area to produce a new prison than that area. So it was starting to learn about these sort of more obscure histories of technology and criminal justice that became really important to me, because what remains constant is you have stigmatized groups of people in cities, and they always have bore the brunt of criminal justice, right? The poor, the immigrants, and Blacks have always been disproportionately targeted by criminal justice systems throughout, the histories of these different groups in different ways. So what happens when those groups end up in cities, and when factory jobs have left and there's no working opportunities, right? And you get, of course, drug markets that sort of fill the void of the labor markets. And, and we see things similar today in rural America with like the opiate crisis. It's similar in some respects. These are people who might have worked in factories, but the factories left. Right, and you get more unemployment, and you see drug crises. But of course, the response is very different, right? And that's where, of course, racial difference comes into play. But so what I wanted to do was to look at all of that literature that looked at mass incarceration, and what I noticed is when it comes to the political economy of mass incarceration, there were a couple things that was predominant in the literature. One was that most are looking at the prison industrial complex in relation to industrialization, industrial or deindustrialization. People who might have worked in factories, but also people who worked in public jobs. And then two, there's a lot of great literature on mass incarceration and war on crime and real estate. And what they look at is typically in the 90s, when cities want to redevelop themselves and become globally competitive tourist attractions. They use policing like broken windows policing, quality of life policing, zero tolerance policing to really crack down on the undesirable people that might hurt redevelopment efforts. So this includes sweeping the homeless from the shopping centers in the central business districts, and essentially putting them on the urban periphery or in specific neighborhoods. And when they come out of those neighborhoods, they're subjected to heightened surveillance, so much like the Simone Brown's, of course, book, probably does this, shows this, I think, in the most vivid way. And what I want, so mostly it's real estate or it's industrialization, but for me, what I wanted to look at was the IT sector. What is the role of the IT sector in the war on crime and in the sort of transformation of racial criminalization? So that leads us to the smart city. And that is sort of where most of my work is looking at, and it's trying to understand, what does carceral governance mean for an overwhelmingly urban, located populations when the city becomes a smart city. And I sort of wanted to know, how does a lot of the great literature that we tend to draw on in media studies, how does it, what can we add, or what does it not have for this particular question? So here are my slides. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks. So, okay. So first, if we look at it, I had a slide for the industrial city. I had companies like General Motors, General Electric, Pacific Mills. And when I think of the industrial city, for me, what I think of is a city that is, the economic engine is manufacturing, and the sort of economic powerhouses would be industrial firms, and the ways that they would transform the city through either massive factories that maybe pollute the environment, through drawing a lot of industrial and factory workers into cities and having to build up bigger public housing units. And the like. The political economy transforms the actual material environment. And the deviants that I talked about for the industrial city were homeless people, the paupers, and the labor radicals, right? So in many ways, their demonization was part and parcel due to the fact that they were drags on the political economy. So now I ask, in the smart city, who are the new deviants? And this quote is from Ruthie and Craig Gilmore. And this sort of, I think, crystallized what I wanted to do. And they say that the state's management of racial categories is analogous to the management of highways or ports or telecommunication. Racist ideological and material practices are infrastructure that needs to be updated, upgraded, and modernized periodically. So in this quote, they give an analogy that sort of racial governance is like infrastructure or telecommunications or highway. And for me, I said, I don't think we need to think of it only as an analogy. I read this and I'm thinking about the Internet of Things, and I'm thinking about literal architecture, or the literal built environment, or infrastructure, I should say. This sort of crystallized for thinking, okay, I'm thinking about the smart city. What is the infrastructure of the smart city? And it's essentially the Internet of Things, this picture. This is one of sort of the visions that a lot of these tech companies will give to city boosters. The connected city that runs on the Internet of Things. And the Internet of Things is this idea that these are computers talking to computers in the background. So sensors of computers that are running all different types of systems. They're running our transportation systems, our wastewater systems, our electrical energy systems. So for me, my question was, how do I map this onto the criminal justice system? When we talked about it a little bit earlier in the seminar, how the idea of the system, right, it really gets applied into governance in the 60s. So in trying to explain how these things converge, the IT sector, the Internet of Things, racial criminalization, and mass incarceration, I start with the 9/11. We sort of have to start with 9/11, and because during 9/11 you get a dispersion of these data fusion centers, and this is what you're looking at, Lower Manhattan, which was a plan where there were cameras which were predominantly concentrated in high tourist areas and in the business districts, the financial districts, and in public transportation, but they were predominantly to stop a terrorist attack in like a downtown, a heavily dense typically more wealthy part of the city. And in all the feeds, you've probably seen the camera feeds all go into one control room where there's a person looking for suspicious activities or trends. So the Lower Manhattan Security Initiative would be a 9/11, post 9/11 institution, but it's important because if we go to the next slide, what happens in the late 2000s increasingly is that you see those data fusion centers, police departments starting to adopt the same sort of tools that were used for the war on crime. And these are the same tools of, if you look on the screen, right, you'll see, of course, profiles of people, information about them, social network analysis of, and some of this comes through social media data, like who are their friends, have any of their friends, do they have criminal records, of course, constant cameras, and all of this sort of intel, you see the pictures, you could, not biometrics exactly, but sort of bodily information. And so what I start to see is, well, just like with the 60s, where you see a militarization of police and you see the National Guard, right, suppressing resistance in a lot of urban Black communities, and those pictures from the 60s, right? Essentially what you see is war, you see the military institution being used to essentially manage social problems that were happening in the so-called inner city. So we see the same thing in the smart city. We're seeing essentially wartime technology or wartime institutions, data fusion centers, which get rebranded and transformed into real-time crime centers, is what they're typically called. But now every major US city will have, well, they'll have multiple data fusion centers for Homeland Security, but they'll also have, their police departments will have these real-time crime centers. Yeah, so if we go on to the next, so this is, this picture is, I forgot to put the attribution on it, but it comes from Columbia's architecture school, and they did this project called the $1 Million Block Project. And what you're looking at is essentially the dense red rectangles are blocks with high numbers of people who have been arrested. And what I wanted to understand is, okay, we have these, sometimes we call them like archipelagos within the city, and you're looking at New York City, I should also mention. So you have these archipelagos of high arrest blocks and areas in the city. And so the question for me becomes, well, who are these new deviants and what is their relation to the smart city? And then we sort of have to think of the smart city. What does it really represent? Of course, it represents the, the creative class and, not only tech workers, but finance workers, students as well, of course, but people who are sort of in the upper tiers of the new economy, the knowledge economy. And these red dots would be the people who are for the most part, locked out of that new economy, that new reality of the conspicuous consumption, the going and getting our college degrees or getting some IT job or things like that. So if you go to the next screen, my question is sort of, okay, what are the infrastructure that are built around those red areas, right? What are the sort of digital architecture like around those archipelago areas? Because those real-time crime centers, a lot of them, of course, a lot of the dispatch and a lot of the crime data comes from arrests that takes place in those areas. So it's those areas that find themselves under constant surveillance. So of course, like Kathy O'Neill's Weapons of Mass Destruction is, I think, a really, really good and accessible, she breaks it down, like you're getting the data from those red areas. So then the cameras are only looking at those red areas, or the police are only looking at those red areas. So some of the digital architecture or the digital infrastructure that is used to surveil these areas would be, this is the domain awareness system in New York. And the important thing is that it was co-designed with IBM and the New York Police Department. And what it is it's a big data warehouse, and it has on file people who've been arrested, but also, well, you could actually read it, but also potential threats. But the thing about the domain awareness system is that it has access to, in a paper that I read that was published by the NYPD, over 33 billion public records. And we live in a time of big data. We live in a time of surveillance, and everybody, of course, is worried about their personal data being harvested and passed around and sold and looked at. But what I'm looking at is that these types of data are feeding into police patrol, and police are a quasi-military institution, right? So in many ways, I've started to become almost obsessed with databases and the history of databases, and going back to someone like Lisa Lowe's work on colonialism and the ways that registries were used for problematic colonial subjects, right, is something that comes to mind. And I'm thinking of these big database systems that are only specifically for certain groups, and they might sort of have the same privacy and personal data issues as a lot of us more fortunate people have. But for these are being collected by the police for tactical reasons. So, we sort of need to change, I think, expand our understanding of the problems that come with personal data being harvested, especially by government. This slide here is the mobility initiative in New York City, and it was a Motorola NYPD collaborative project. And essentially they built a suite of applications, apps for cops. But one of them that I find really important is on the right side, forms: prepare and transmit injury, illness, automobile accidents, use of force reports, complaints, arrest paperwork, all in the field. And for me, the very interesting thing here is what you're seeing through, of course, wireless networks is an externalization of criminal justice procedures onto the street, and often onto those areas, those bright red areas that are criminalized or over-criminalized. So it's not only that we're building up databases about these people that essentially, if we look at them from a political economy view or from a racial view, are the undesirable, unwanted, or marginalized groups. Building up databases specifically for them, but it's also taking a lot of the practices that we use to document them that would have been in a government building and bringing them out into the street. So what you're seeing is a decentralization of the carceral system. And then this is another example. This is the spatial analysis. This is essentially the geolocation data of people with ankle bracelets. Who wear electronic ankle bracelets, and the software is built for parole and probation officers, so they can always check in on where the parolee or probationer is moving. Also, another thing that's common with the ankle bracelets is they build what's called a geofence, which is essentially, if you imagine if I drew a circle onto that map that you're looking at, and I said the individual can only move within that circle. And if the individual goes across the circle outside of it, then the nearest available patrol unit will be alerted or notified. Yeah, so it's another way of sort of bringing the practices of course, circumscribing someone's mobility. And most ankle bracelets, I should say, are used for house arrest anyway. So they are used to immobilize the person and essentially, in the case of house arrest, arrest them within their residential dwellings, which converts oftentimes public housing into more prison-like structures. Or they could do it through geofences, which creates like this invisible carceral like force field, where if the person goes across, they'll be notified. So next is the Verizon building in New York City. So there's so many technologies, you can never list them all. It would be impossible. But one of the things that you get in a lot of cities, in New York included, is there's so much video camera data feeds, and there are so many personal databases. And there's so much data that they needed more storage. So they rented out a room in the Verizon building, so they have servers in that building. So, you know, this is just another, I think, example of thinking about the way that the carceral system is being sort of externalized out into public space. And, you know, I don't want to make any predictions, but within the last 5 years or so, the prison population has been declining. Now, I don't think that necessarily means that it has to completely decline. It might reverse itself. You can never really predict the future. But if we do want to look at the prospect of mass incarceration falling apart, a lot of due to it's really expensive, actually. You know, the cities found out to incarcerate millions of people. And if mass incarceration does crumble and fall apart, what I am sort of looking at is the groundwork has already been laid for sort of relocating the institutions, transforming and changing the institutions that are charged with the very same practices of keeping heavier surveillance and restricting the mobility or policing more densely these areas. So in some, I have a couple points. So the first is that war on crime policies, strategies, and tactics are embedded in smart city infrastructure. So it's the idea that, you know, the politics of the past are embedded in the digital technologies in many ways. And so then I think a lot of people, obviously, and Shakir will talk about this, are starting to recognize this and starting to resist it. Second, the IT sector is key in transforming and expanding carceral space. Now, when I wrote this, I thought it was clever, but now everybody knows that. But when I was originally looking at it, I was saying, well, the IT sector, you know, has economic incentive of this transformation, of this externalization of the carceral state. And then third and lastly, you know, and this is why, you know, I'm really happy to talk to Shakir, but these changes demand new strategies for abolition. So, you know, 10 years ago, or maybe even more recently, you know, we were really focused. Decarceration was the name of the game, and it still should be. Of course, I agree. And there, you know, there've been other carceral projects to happen within that time, especially with immigrants. But we also have to look at the ways that the sort of socio-technical transformation of mass criminalization and carceral governance, because it looks like we'll have a lot to fight in the future, not only just incarceration. So thank you.
Yeah, hi everyone, and thanks, Brian. So yeah, I'm going to be talking about the response. And yeah, Brian, thank you for this awesome, extremely perceptive talk. It's rare to get to hear something that's so kind of true to, grounded in the operation of modern policing and the things that police are doing every day with their eyes and their ears, with their databases, with their batons, their cameras, while also kind of placing those details in a broader historical arc that helps us, that reminds us of the legacy of the political fights that we're having now, that the kind of fights that came before us, and that remind us how these systems were built, and also how they're being rebuilt right in front of us, and how they're being transformed. So I think I'm going to respond by connecting your research with my experience as a lawyer and a community organizer, dismantling these systems that you're talking about. And then after that, I want to pick up on a few themes in your talk and your book that I think are really important for abolitionist activism and organizing around these issues. So first I'll talk about my work and how it connects to what you've been talking about. So I moved to Los Angeles about 1.5 years ago, and before that I lived in New York. So I have some experience with the systems you're talking about and the NYPD's kind of role as a pioneer of data-driven policing, of big data policing, and kind of this digital carceral infrastructure that you talk about. In New York, I worked at the Bronx Defenders Public Defense Office, working on systemic litigation against police and courts. And a few of the cases that I worked on took on the central role of police data mining and data harvesting in these systems that you talk about. So NYPD, as you say, has been one of the pioneers of data-driven policing. And one of the ways that that system was built, or that kind of paradigm of policing was built over time, is through the development of this system of policing, or the switch to policing that's all about kind of generating repeated police contact. As you talked about, in the shift from paper files to databases, that it was all about kind of how to deal with and process the kind of mass amount of people who are being stopped, who are being arrested, who are being arraigned, and what that has evolved into over time is a system that mainly manages kind of people through repeat police contact, not necessarily through what we think about of adjudication in courts, nor even through a lot, at least up front, of incarceration, imprisonment. Instead, it's just police constantly stopping, frisking people, constantly making these broken windows arrests for small offenses that you talked about. And all of those stops, arrests, out front, all those police encounters become data. Every time police are stopping you or seeing you or questioning you, they're generating data that they're then filling into these systems, and then that data is being recycled the next time they see you, flagging you as a repeat offender or person of interest. And then this data then determines what ends up happening in court. As public defenders will tell you, when you're arrested and processed through these bureaucracies, one of the biggest things that's determining what is going to happen, especially in the kind of adjudicated model of, there's hundreds of people being processed every day, and a public defender is seeing a whole bunch of cases, and cases are just cycling through judges for a couple minutes at a time. The primary things that are determining your outcomes in those hearings are usually, at least at first, your prior arrest record and your history with policing and criminalization. So prosecutors and judges are just looking at, those records, these systems that you're talking about, and seeing, okay, you've been arrested 6 times, or you've been arrested this many times, and this one resulted in a plea, and this one resulted in a deferred adjudication or something or other. And so that is going to determine, that's usually what the judge is going to go off to decide whether you get bail, what kind of plea you get. And so that's how all of this kind of the information generation that you're talking about are very much determining what's happening to people in court. And so that's a system that, again, is not necessarily about adjudicating guilt or anything. It's more a system of processing, sorting, and labeling, managing the population based on, of course, the categories of criminalization and based on policing. And it goes beyond just carceral consequences, because when judges are doing that processing and managing of cases, when prosecutors are deciding kind of what they're willing to negotiate and offer, they're making decisions about things that go beyond incarceration. They're thinking, your public defender might be trying to get you a plea that's immigration safe, that won't result in deportation, or a plea that lets you keep your job as you keep your license to be a school nurse, or decide whether you're going to get bail and be able to keep your job. Those kinds of things. So those kinds of things. It's sort of all about those threats of losing your home, of facing deportation, or even losing your kids through the child welfare system. Those are all at stake in these cases, and all of that is being kind of adjudicated and managed through all this data that's generated on people. And generated through the system. And so that's kind of this information capitalism, the kind of mass data smart city that you're talking about, that's how it's using surveillance and criminalization to structure all kinds of things in the lives of predominantly Black and brown people. It's kind of a vast carceral bureaucracy, and criminal justice data is central to managing all those relationships and managing all of those outcomes. So one case I worked on was challenging the data inputs of these systems by basically trying to restrict when the NYPD could hold on to data generated by arrests. So as I said, every time you're arrested, all this information is collected on you and fed into these systems. But and the point is that all that data remains in these systems even after an arrest might be, or a case might be thrown out in court or dismissed. More than half of arrests by the NYPD don't result in a conviction, but even though you're not being kind of punished in court for that, it's becoming part of your record and part of how the whole kind of punishment bureaucracy is going to continue to see you the next time the police target you and pick you up. Another case I worked on was challenging risk assessment tools that ICE was using to determine which immigrants they arrested would be detained. So this was an algorithmic tool that they would feed some information into, and then it would put out it would classify people based on a risk category, and then also decide recommend whether the person should be detained or not. It turned out the whole thing was a farce because ICE had rigged the algorithm so that it recommended detention for every single person who went through. This change happened in early 2017 after President Trump took office, and was part of the administration's zero tolerance policy kind of scheme of increasing immigrant detention. And I bring this up to show in a similar way to how you're talking about in the book, of how these technologies that we're talking about will always be put in the hands of people who will use them to do what they kind of want to do anyway, and that those are political choices about what who's being detained and who's going to be prosecuted and arrested, and they always will be political choices. They always will be political choices until we transform the power structures and the kind of political structures around them. And until then, these tools, no matter kind of how accurate and how refined the data is, will always be kind of used as cover for oppressive political choices. A third case that I worked on, or something I was investigating, was NYPD's role in these heavily kind of militarized gang takedowns, where the police, working with prosecutors and federal officials, collaborated to do these mass arrests. There were like pre-dawn raids of every young person who lived in a housing project or a couple blocks, just kind of rounding up all the youth, alleging that they were all part of a criminal conspiracy, charging them with racketeering with the RICO federal racketeering laws. And it was basically always just a group of youth who, due to New York's geographic segregation, were they were a group of youth who all knew each other and grew up together, and were just kind of the community there. But these cases were built using all kinds of sophisticated data analysis, Palantir systems, and a lot of them were actually driven by a predictive prosecution unit within the Manhattan DA's office called the Crime Strategies Unit. And prosecutors would come and say that they used all this data and analysis to map out these gang networks, and they were proactively and predictively taking down these gangs and these crews. And that data was a big part of that, and the social network analysis you talk about, and the domain awareness system, and all of these tools were part of how they mapped out these networks and mapped out these gangs, and claimed that all of these youth were involved in a vast kind of criminal enterprise. Of course, we know that this kind of wholesale criminalization of Black and brown youth is nothing new, and that when police wanted to do it before, they would just go out and use dragnet arrests or just round up everyone. And now they don't do that. Instead, they can use these tools to do much the same thing while claiming it's something different, something predictive or data driven. And so that kind of is part of this evolution of the smart city that you've been talking about. So that's some of what I worked in New York. And so now I'm in Los Angeles, and I've been here for about a year and a half. And one of the first things I noticed when I moved here is that, compared to New York, just how few police you see just on the street. That might seem weird to Angelenos who feel like there's a lot of police everywhere, and it's true that there's too many police and too much policing and too much money spent on policing. But compared to New York, at least, where it's like literally on every street corner, there seems to be several cops, and a dozen cops will show up on a moment's notice anywhere, mainly to just kind of stand around and project force. It's just a different level of force. And this is, I think, where your work is also helpful for understanding that difference, is that what you highlight about the role of these carceral technologies and databases and digital technologies, just that process of surveilling, categorizing, the heat mapping, hotspotting that you're talking about, that's a big part of how LAPD, even if they are not physically on every street corner in the same way that police in New York are, that's how policing really operates in LA. And LA and the LAPD have been kind of pioneers of predictive policing, of algorithmic policing, in a way that even if you don't see police and police cars everywhere like you do in other cities, surveillance and data gathering and information and data mining are a big part of how police are nonetheless everywhere, and how everything that the state does, everything that the state sees is processed through policing. So in LA, I've been involved with the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, which calls all of that. It's just to introduce, it's a grassroots community organization that works to abolish police surveillance. So Stop LAPD Spying Coalition refers to that kind of information sharing environment as the stalker state. And so I'm going to talk about a couple points in your talk and your book that I think are really connected to how the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition works to frame surveillance and explain surveillance and organize and build power around what the role of surveillance is. So I'm going to pick a couple of themes from what you've been talking about, and then I think ask you questions about them. So the first one is your focus on not just kind of the cutting edge and technologies of the future, but yesterday's technologies. And you talk about how police data gathering and data mining are nothing new. And in fact, how the technological pieces for that were installed over time, including technologies that, of course, that seem kind of rudimentary to us now, but were innovative at the time. And so, the interesting thing about police surveillance is that it always feels like this sensational new high-tech thing, and that people are always feel like it's like a cutting edge kind of development. And what's powerful in the way that you're talking about it, I think, is that it's very attentive to how, there's been these transformations of how the technology is used over time, but it's built on the record management systems and database technologies, the IT infrastructure that is decades old. And that that's what is, if we're going to be working to dismantle and target these systems, that's what we need to be organizing around. That it's not just the Palantir system, it's that entire digital infrastructure around it. And so Stop LAPD Spying Coalition has been involved in, we've been doing a kind of really deep analysis of the LAPD's budget and kind of breaking down that budget and identifying places that trying to map out the role of surveillance and technology in the growth of the LAPD's budget over the last several years. The LAPD's spending has grown 50% during the time that Garcetti has been mayor, and a lot of that is the technology spending. And again, so that's not just your most high-tech examples of that. It's also the records management system. It's the Microsoft Developer Network. It's IBM's database systems, the cloud hosting. All of that is what's being used. And if you only focus kind of on the cutting edge technology, you're playing a losing game. At the same time, as we see these new technologies emerging, we need to recognize that these technologies were at a moment where these things will also become normal over time. And I think a good example of that is facial recognition, and which seems now like a kind of, or maybe not now, but for the last couple of years, has seemed like this sort of science fiction future technology. And I think the point is, like, how we respond to that today is really going to set the standard for how normal these technologies become. I mean, if we take an approach, as a lot of reformers are taking, of that facial recognition is imperfect, that it has flaws, or that it's not accurate enough, but it might be acceptable with the kind of right vetting and right rules and restrictions, then eventually those technologies will also become integral to the system of oppression and become as normal as the technologies and systems that we're talking about from the past. So instead, I think when we see those emergences, we need to instead say, no, that facial recognition is unacceptable, dangerous tool that should never be in police hands, and that, quite frankly, should be in the hands of it shouldn't be in the hands of landlords or be in capitalist hands at all. That we need to think of that technology as kind of untouchable and dangerous in any form, in whatever form. And we need to not just try to restrict the technology, but try to attack and dismantle the entire ecosystem around it, the ecosystem of the research institutions that produce it, the corporations who are invested in it, and really root out the technology that we consider dangerous in a fundamental way, rather than just sort of thinking of restrictions for it. Another thing that that your work talks on, I mean, you've been talking about the role of these of police data mining and surveillance as a form of social control, which I think is different from the lens that a lot of critics of surveillance approach this stuff, which is through the lens of surveillance. or through the lens of privacy, I mean, that the problem with surveillance is that it infringes on privacy. So the coalition is rooted in Skid Row, which is one of the most over-policed geographic parts of the country. And a big part of why we reject this kind of privacy frame for surveillance and attacking surveillance is that privacy is kind of a liberal privilege that most of our neighbors and our comrades in Skid Row don't enjoy, that just being in public space, just walking around, means that they're subject to surveillance, and that privacy is something that they can't enjoy. They don't have homes to go to. And so, and your book talks about that, how that people, we might think of poor communities and homeless people as kind of a place where there isn't technology, where there's a lack of kind of information, where there's kind of an information black hole you talk about. But in fact, those are communities that are more subject to surveillance and data gathering than anyone else. And so the reason we reject this kind of privacy type of framework is that what that usually leads to is just thinking about surveillance in terms of a balance of privacy on the one hand versus safety, and the kind of figuring out the right trade-offs of that. But what we know is that in the system of racial capitalism and of information capitalism that you talk about, that balance, if you're constantly just trying to negotiate that balance or figure out that balance, the balance will always remain oppressive to Black and brown communities. That's kind of a losing game. And that if you're fighting on that terrain, and I say this as a lawyer, that's where a lot of the legal fight is, of kind of figuring out the line of how much infringement of privacy we're willing to tolerate in exchange for safety, we're going to keep losing. So that's why I think we also embrace this thinking of surveillance as an instrument of social control, of racial control, like you're talking about. And the kind of final theme that I want to ask you about and talk about is about reform and criminal justice reform and reform to these systems, because so much of I think the data-driven policing and just even an emphasis on evidence-based solutions and data-driven and data-based kind of solutions has been introduced through a lens of reform, and that and has been presented as reforms. And so, even in the kind of reform ecosystem now, there's a real kind of focus on the need for better data, more generalizable data on police violence, on how jail populations work, on tracking recidivism. And so the problem, from that perspective, is framed as a lack of data about those problems, but also that the data is so disparate because we have so many disconnected jail systems, and that rural jails and small and in smaller systems, that the data isn't as good as it is in places like New York and LA, and that part of why, and that the more data we develop on that, the more we'll be able to kind of understand where police violence is too excessive, or where probation isn't working correctly, or why bail is unfair. And so there's some problems with that. I mean, one is that when you're looking at it that way, what you're kind of walking into is this idea that any of these things can be calibrated or refined to the correct amount. That if we have enough data on the problem, we'll be able to understand what a fair amount or a acceptable amount of violence might be, or incarceration might be, or recidivism might be. And that, again, I think similar to what I was saying about the trade-offs between safety and privacy, is that's obviously a problem, because I think that's another terrain in which if that's where we're limiting our fight, we're going to lose, because that's always going to be that, like, refining, trying to figure out what that correct balance is always going to favor the interests of the ruling class, and will always be oppressive to the people who have always been most targeted by these systems. But and another way that it's harmful, though, I think, is that a lot of these same systems that are being built for, in the name of accountability or reform or transparency, are also at the same time part of how we're building these, like the data-driven policing, and how we're building predictive policing. And LAPD even for example, LAPD has, as I was saying, has been kind of a pioneer of predictive policing systems. In particular, has been, there's a program that the Stop LAPD Spying Coalition worked to dismantle over many years called LASER, the Los Angeles Strategic Extraction and Restoration Program, as well as PredPol, which is a private company founded by a UCLA anthropology professor that also is kind of it's about predicting crime and identifying hotspots. A lot of the same technological infrastructure for implementing those systems were also the same systems that LAPD promotes as we need these database systems for our officer accountability program. So there, and we see this even today. So both of those programs were dismantled, but LAPD in its latest budget proposal that came out a couple weeks ago, that is its largest budget. They're asking for their largest budget ever. They justify some of these, like some of these technological systems as they need this particular IBM database system that they use for predictive analytics and predictive prosecution, but they're saying they need it for their officer accountability early warning system. And so in that same way, you keep seeing how, especially with the kind of predictive technology and predictive policing, they're often saying that these are, we need these data systems to make policing more efficient, to make it kind of more progressive. We have a new actually DA in Los Angeles who, George Gascon, who was elected this month, who's being sworn in on Monday. He took power very much on a kind of reform agenda, describing himself as a progressive prosecutor and supported by a lot of the criminal justice reform establishment. He's been kind of promoting and before coming to LA, he was for many years he was a LAPD officer, and then he was the DA in San Francisco, as well as police chief in San Francisco and police chief in Arizona, has been a pioneer of kind of data-driven and predictive policing systems. When you look at his kind of his campaign agenda, he talks in the same breath about the need for data to kind of improve, to monitor whether prosecutors are acting fairly, whether there's discrimination in the system, but also in that same that kind of same platform of data and efficiency is also how he's talking about his plans to create a crime strategies unit in LA, that's the predictive prosecution unit that exists in New York and that he created in San Francisco. So there you very much see that same kind of focus on data as both presented as part of reform, and also, you know, creating things that we'll probably be having to work to dismantle in the future, like predictive policing.
Yeah, no, a lot of the things you said, it's interesting because a lot of the ways that I came into thinking about this entire project was, I'm familiar with Bronx Defenders, and at the time, I imagine you might know the Communities United for Police Reform, in New York, and sort of the entry point for me was the debates over the stop and frisk data, and you know, it was really complicated and convoluted because, you know, a lot of the civil liberties activists and they wanted the race to be included into the data to show that the stops were disproportionately affecting Black and brown people. So that, yeah, it's the same thing what you're talking about now, this sort of loop of how much do we want to rely on more data, more technology, and sort of how does it create this sort of feedback loop of, well, there's going to be more data, more surveillance, even if it's safety it could be from police violence. But one of the things when thinking about these sort of technical solutions that comes to mind that you were talking about is, I think it's really important, and I tried to emphasize it in the book, that this the buildup of sort of the digitization of carceral governance is largely a liberal story of Democrats. right? It's not, we have on one hand the militarization of the police, which is bipartisan, but we know, of course, during the Reagan administration, but I started with the Lyndon Johnson administration. And in many ways, it's this really sort of stereotypical faith in technocracies and technological elites, and using technical solutions for social problems. And one of the things that is, you know, in talking to people in, especially like in litigation, funny thing, I was talking to some folks in New York, and they're trying to get the gang database erased. Yeah, and the legal people were asking the academics, can you give me an example of the technology leading to a racist outcome? And it was sort of funny because a lot of the academics are scratching their heads. But I said that, you know, I don't necessarily think that's the best way to do it, because if you do say this technology or this algorithm leads to a racist outcome, then they'll just tweak it. And then they'll say, okay, well, this one, we'll use this one. But to me, it's not really a question of a causality of, is the technology causing racism? And like you said, right, because racism and racial profiling and policing has pre-existed digital technology by a long time, right? So the problem is racist policing. It's first and foremost, right? That's the foundation, and finding solutions to try to you know, have less policing and less police violence, and stop relying on what is, again, a quasi-military institution to deal with some of the social ills that come with poverty, that come with mass unemployment or underemployment, that come with not having you know, legal rights and having the rights of a citizen. So I think what you're saying, Shakir, I'm the same. I think that's the way I'm looking at it too, is that so much of these technologies have been rolled out to reform the police and to make them more humane, or even to make, if you look in the 80s, to get community involvement in policing. So community policing in the 80s and 90s, there, you know, I talk a little bit about it. There were all types of technological like data terminals. Some police precincts imagined that there would be data terminals in the station. Some imagined they would be on every block of certain communities. And the idea was that you could, in the 80s and 90s, right, this is before mobile phones, smartphones, the idea that the community members would type in information to police departments about the community. And this was seen as a progressive way of integrating minorities into the everyday decision-making of the police department. And on its head, on its surface, you know, it does look like it, you know, I do still think it's better to have more cooperation, of course, than antagonism. But what that does is it embeds these technologies and surveillance in these communities in a deeper way. And then the second thing you said was about privacy, and I definitely agree with you. And I think I think so much of the literature in academia and journalism, we have to think that they are by middle class, upper middle class users of technology, like myself, like, so I'm not, you know, saying excluding myself, but so my issue with technology might be privacy, my personal data, right? As you know, for my bank account or my online shopping habits, right? And I might be thinking about those data being protected. But I think what happens in academia and in a lot of journalists is that those very sort of specific problems with digital technology are universalized as the most important issues of the day. And I think people like LAPD Stop Spying and like Stop in New York is a similar organization. I think what they're really showing is that, you know, first of all, we're not necessarily looking at just people who are using technology, right? Some of them it's forced upon them in the case of ankle bracelets. Some of them, it's a camera that's put in their own housing complex, right, against their will. They're not users, they're objects of the technology. So, you know, the privacy, they are losing their privacy in ways, you know, even more so than, or maybe to the same degree as some users, But the problem is not only privacy, it's that they're being surveilled by military institutions, and that these institutions are what are being used to establish order in places that might have disorder legitimately from all of the social problems that come with unemployment and the same social problems we see in rural America right now, right? You see more violence, you see more drug use, and you see people, of course, when their aspirations are crushed, what it does in terms of crime and drug abuse and these things. But again, the question is, is there a profusion of ankle bracelets and cameras in these communities? No. So because they're not, I think we have to stop thinking about privacy of the individual and start thinking about social groups. And I think what is implicitly in the privacy stuff, you said it's the liberal individualism, right? It's me, it's my personal privacy, it's my personal data. That should be my property. That's sort of the lens through which it's often seen through. But if we look through like to the radical tradition and we look at the level of social groups, then we realize all of these differences. And the privacy invasion might be different. They might not, as in the case of Skid Row, privacy might not even be part of the equation to start with. So that's not applicable if we look at people, homeless people, as a social group, right? Or if we look at Black or Latinx or Middle Easterners who are profiled, that if you look at the level of social group, you start to see that privacy might not be the universal anxiety of all people when it comes to technology. It just so happens to be the anxiety of the people who write about the technology. So that would be second. And then first, the first thing you said in terms of thinking about all of the connections is, to me, that is what's such powerful about abolition. And abolition has become sort of a buzzword, and it's been Twitterized essentially. But if we go back to the way that Angela Davis was talking about it, that's exactly what she was saying. She was saying that it's not only the prison system, right? It's also the vendor who gives the toilet paper, or who gives the to the prison, or who gives food to the prison, or the electric company who provides lighting in the prison, right? They all have an economic vested interest in mass incarceration. So for me, I'm really just trying to rip off their work and, or try to build from it really, and look at it vis-a-vis IT and say, look, there's a vested interest that that they sell more cameras, or that they have bigger databases, or that you use their apps, or police departments use there's a story in New York you might know of, they developed that slide I showed, the mobility initiative. It was Motorola, and then the operating system went obsolete. So it was like $30 million of taxpayer money that was down the drain, and they adopted iPhones, right? So there's a history of that jockeying for what type of phones do police officers use. And then, as you said, it extends to the university. And a lot of what I was writing about was also the sort of the computer scientist. You talked about Predpol, that's an anthropologist. He worked also with a mathematician from Santa Cruz, right? A lot of their work has been subsidized through public grant money, and essentially to build an algorithm, which is, or a software that is turned into a commodity, which is sold on the market, not only to US law enforcement, but beyond, right? So there's that part, and I think as an academic, that's where I could sort of shed some light of things that might not be as visible to the public, but the industry, when it comes to academics and when it comes to these big research grants that, from the National Institute of Justice, or when it comes to in 2015, the Department of Homeland Security opened a Silicon Valley program where it funds small tech companies. And so, thinking like the abolition framework, from at least the way that, Davis articulated it, it's not just, we need to get rid of the police or we need to shut down the prisons. It's thinking of all of the different connections between those prisons and society at large, because it doesn't only stop with policing or with prisons. And even more so, I think, in the stuff that I look at, right? If you could, if I were to get into like speculative, sci-fi, like you could imagine a future where there are no police stations, where they don't need to be policed. You can defund the police and they could be disappeared. And I don't think that would be the end of racial criminalization, because there's a new architecture that could rely on new tactics that might be cheaper in the future. That is why I think it's so important to look at sort of the political economy and this is from the tradition of Ruthie Gilmore, of Angela Davis, of all the way back W.E.B. Du Bois, at least for what I look at, seeing that these relations that sustain these racial practices, they're pervasive. So, how do we abolish it? It's not only through one institution. It's about the social relations that constitute the institution.
Yeah, the whole ecology and ecosystem around it, and yeah, that's even the term prison industrial complex is meant to capture that this is that abolition requires dismantling even the university systems that produce this, the corporate systems that produce it. Kind of related to that point about abolition, I mean, like you were saying, abolition is of course not just about destroying police and prisons, so that is a part of it, and I feel like, especially with abolition kind of becoming Twitterized, like you said, we've been hearing a lot about that abolition is about building, not just about destroying. On that, can you talk about we're talking about how a lot of these data practices and technologies are entering through a language of reform, but what kind of opportunities do they create for thinking about safety without surveillance, safety without police, thinking about a world, the things that we need to build as we abolish policing and surveillance?
Yeah, I talked about a little bit in the seminar, so you have to excuse me if I'm repeating myself, but when I went into my research in New York, for me, I was going into it looking specifically at Black and mostly Puerto Rican communities and thinking about the relation between the NYPD and Black and Brown communities. And going in through the stop and frisk conflict. And what came out was, in looking at the data and talking to people throughout the Communities United for Policing Reform, even just about those data, was I started to see, the sex working community, they were coming in, right? The trans community, people had their stories of being stopped. Homeless people, immigrants, presumed Muslims as well, right? All had their own stories and their own sort of unique interactions with being stopped, as you said, through contact and being surveilled. So I think this is sort of a roundabout way, but to get to your question, I see it as, if you have all of these groups of people who are disproportionately represented inside a database, then what you've done is you've created a coalition, right? And it's just but the trick is that, how do we develop a language, and how do we develop organizations and ways of talking to one another that doesn't only just focus on our differences, but to say, hey, why are we all in this? What do we have in common? And I think so through my experience researching and sort of tagging along with that movement, I saw that the technology, I think we're in a sort of a critical mass where we have people in Los Angeles, in New York, at the US-Mexico border, who are all looking at, and in cities all throughout the country, right, who are all looking at how these surveillance technologies are being used on certain groups in a targeted way. And so I think by making those surveillance practices visible and then speaking to one another, right, it's the groundwork for a multi sort of cultural coalition against both surveillance and racial criminalization. And, then how do we link that into the mainstream privacy debates? But so I tend to think of it, it's a bit, I guess, dialectical, but I tend to think of the more we expose of these technologies, the more opportunities we have to build across groups. And I just from looking at activists and especially grad students, it seems like, I want to have some hope that you're starting to see that.
No, yeah, and especially reflecting back on this year and kind of the transformations we saw around resistance to policing, that's something to be hopeful for. Is seeing so many different causes and different activist communities recognizing the role of policing as really central to the fights that they're having, you know, and in housing, of course, like the role that policing plays, even of course, like, you know, physically being involved in evictions, but something we know from Breonna Taylor's death is like her home was targeted as part of a kind of location-based policing program that is similar to the hotspot policing that exists in a lot of cities. And so, yeah, so seeing kind of the role of policing in gentrification fights, and obviously in immigration fights, and across society has been, I think, yeah, something to be hopeful about.
Yeah. And just looking at it's funny, oftentimes at the talks, especially, and I think rightfully so, you know, academics will get the question, well, what about resistance? You know, the story that you've built. But I always say, just look to the news, look at, you know, don't look to academic book, you know, well, look to like work like you're doing, because, you know, there is resistance. I think the academics are missing it. I think journalists have been, I think, better at covering people resisting. And now academics are sort of talking more with activists, and I think we were all sort of headed in the same direction where there needs to be more coalition building. But there were a couple questions, and maybe you can talk about them too. But one is sort of like the public and the private, and how does the sort of smart city and the smart carceral state distinguish it? But
Yeah, what I want to hear what you think. I mean, especially because, like, thinking about, I mean, even in the name of the talk about racial capitalism and information capitalism, that, yeah, how, though, like, thinking about capitalism and a kind of an anti-capitalist critique, how that helps connect or helps explain this, like, the connection between public versus private.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and for me, that sort of phrase is just a framework that I use because, again, so much of the war on crime literature looks at deindustrialization, and so it looks at industrial capitalism. So that's where the political economy is looking at, is, you know, these people, you know, working in factories and now they're unemployed, so on and so forth. But for me, it's like the IT sector. Now, the question for me is, how does the IT sector, what economic incentive does it have to continue the legacy and transform and perhaps even expand racialized policing? And we can do the same thing, of course, with Border Patrol. We could do the same thing with Homeland Security. Obviously, it has I don't think it's that controversial to say that the companies would like to sell more products. And, you know, so in my case, for racial capitalism, it's looking at sort of how have there been incentives to either to put, most of the work I'm doing because of my research background would be Blacks in America. Sort of how have there been economic incentives in putting like violence around Black people, or in truncating the mobility of Black people, or surveilling you know, Black people in a different way? And that history obviously goes back to at least slavery. And we might have started with agriculture and the agricultural capitalists, and they had a certain relationship to Black individuals as individual persons and their bodies, and them as a group. And then industrial capital in the cities had its own relationship to Black people in this country. And then, so for me, racial capitalism is how IT's sort of capitalists or IT companies also can make profits on, you know, surrounding, in my case, Black and brown people with violence, but also surveilling them differently, and getting paid for it. So you know, that's I think, for me, as coming from political economy critique, it's, you know, I'm not trying to say the end all be all, you know, like this is how you describe racism, because then we get, I think, you know, into these pointless discussions. But what I am trying to trace is there's economic incentive in this country to, well, again, sort of control and immobilize Black people. And it's existed for a long time. And you could say the same with Latinx folks, especially Mexicans, but not only. You could say that DHS with people from the Middle East. If you're the IT company, you can capitalize off of all of these policies. So I don't know if that answers the private policy. But the one thing about the IT sector that we know is that the one thing that it wants to do is generate more information, always generate information about people. So when you bring the IT sector into the equation, and if the technology is always going to erode privacy, because the technology, generating data is a form of surveillance, then the marriage of the carceral state and the IT sector, it would seem to stand to reason that it will erode the privacy of criminalized people, and eventually it will lead to devices being in their homes, which are owned by Department of Corrections, by parole probation officers, and perhaps by police. So yeah, that's what the IT sector does. It takes away privacy, but again, not to beat a dead horse, but my question is towards what end? To sell the data or to give the data to a police officer?
Yeah. What's been actually, one thing I can kind of share from activism around this stuff is, especially with facial recognition, an ally that we've really seen in a lot of those fights has been the labor movement and worker groups, because especially in part because the firms pushing these technologies like Amazon and a lot of these others are like, partly they're planning to use this technology against workers, against their employees, but also though like they're the kind of all the technology services of those companies, the cloud hosting and even just all the IT stuff is helping them kind of subsidize everything else they're doing to break labor power. So that's kind of just another way. Those incentives also mean that there's real potential for alliances between the kind of racial justice movement and the labor movement. There's another question here that maybe is a good one to end on. Maybe it's a very big question though. Is data science in general the problem, and what do you make of the kind of recent trend to try to humanize data or push for ethical technology?
Yeah, we talked about it earlier. It is a great question. I don't know that I have a great answer, but what I do know, it gets back, I think, to earlier our discussion, is to always know that, or is to always be mindful that there are social problems that don't always lend themselves to technical solutions. So even if you humanize the tech, I don't know exactly what that always means, or make it more ethical. Even if that, oftentimes in that literature, that means including people who are excluded from the sort of data ecosystem. Including more representation of underrepresented people. It creates this double-edged sword in which, there is more representation, but now they're drawn into the system of surveillance as well. So, I think as human, I would think of it as like important reform to make these changes, but to not think that if we tweak or if we change the tech just a little bit, then that will be the end of a social problem, which actually its origin has nothing to do with technology, like in the case of racist policing.
Thank you so much, Brian and Shakir. What an amazing searching conversation, dealing with all the important political issues, knowing that there aren't always easy answers, but there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of work already being done that we can really celebrate. So this has been amazing. Thank you so much for coming. I want to thank the audience for joining us for this WHAP. We have one more WHAP this semester. It's happening next week. Calvin Warren, amazing philosopher, is coming to talk to us. Tune in again here at tiny.cc 2020 WHAP, and join our blog and check out the work both of Stop LAPD Spying Coalition, doing really great on the ground work with Shakir and others, and obviously Brian's work, which is up on academia.edu, and I cannot recommend Digitize and Punish enough. So thank you so much.